Hello and welcome to our quick tutorial on adding other elements to your pivot tables. So like any other table of data within Excel, it's pretty easy to create a chart based on it. So if I click somewhere within this table of data, this pivot table, you'll note that underneath the pivot table tools, there's a pivot chart button. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on it. And it gives me a variety of charts that I can use, but in this case it is going to the clustered column as a first choice. So I'm going to go and use that. I'll click on that option and I'll OK it. And you'll see that it just pops this lovely little pivot chart right in here. Now, what you're seeing in this case, it's not coming in here and including like the grand totals within it. So I didn't need to select the data. It just looked at the table and it gives me the data that I require. But you notice that there are no grand total sections within this chart. Now what makes this really interesting is, again, just like a regular table of data in a chart, the two are dynamically linked. So if I go making changes here, they'll be reflected here. And I don't mean making changes in data, I mean making changes in filtering, for instance. So if I click the down arrow here and I choose maybe Mr. Gestetner and I OK it, you'll see that the data changes just to reflect him. Now, similarly, I can go and clear that filter, or set it back to all. I can click OK, and the data comes back. Now, what makes this kind of interesting is that I can do the filtering from here, but you'll notice there's also a drop down here as well. So if I click here and I choose Gestetner, and I OK it, it goes back to being that previous chart, but you'll see that the table is now filtered by Gestetner. Another thing you may notice is if I go and clear the filter from this side, set it back to all, that one of the problems I might run into that people don't necessarily like is that, granted, I could choose the salesperson here, but it really doesn't tell me who the salesperson is unless I can see here who it is. I really don't get a good idea. So what I might elect to do instead is pivot the chart just like I would pivot the table. So if I go and I drag salesperson here beneath country, suddenly you're going to see it's now broken up by country, but you'll also see that it's also broken up by salesperson as well. Again, because I pivoted the chart, the table pivots as well. So as mentioned in previous tutorials, get in there and play and pivot this material around and see how it changes things. Now you'll also see that country and item are also possible ways I can filter. So I can take away the check mark from select all and maybe just choose Australia and New Zealand. I can OK it. You'll see that the table changes to reflect the data, and I see that I only get Australia and New Zealand compared over here. I could also filter by the items as well. I'm going to go back. I'm going to clear the filter from country, and away we go. Now, something that we can also do, and this is just, it's not so much inserting something different into our pivot tables or charts, but you'll notice that sometimes the pivot table process will leave us with just some generic names. So in an instance like this, rather than saying column labels, maybe what I'm going to choose to do is I'll change this and I'll change it to maybe product names. That might work a little bit better. And row labels, I might, I don't necessarily want to call them country because I already have that field sitting there. That might cause a little bit of confusion, but maybe I'll say sales area. or country of sale. That would be kind of long-winded though. Now, even though I go and I change the names, they still work as they've always worked before with drop downs. So again, I can filter them as I always do. The other thing I can do is I can come in here and at this point it's already pretty well sorted, but if I click in this column, I can still come in and sort Z to A if I want, and you'll see how it changes both the chart and the data. I'm going to go back and click there and go back to A over Z, and it will return me to where I previously was. Now, the other thing you can keep in mind is that you can also come in here, and if you want to take something out of this mix, for instance, if I don't want salesperson to be part of this anymore, I can simply come in here and uncheck them, and they disappear out of the respective zone beneath your field names, and it also disappears off the chart and off the table of data itself. And if I want to pop that information back in, I can just click and drag it back down there as well. Another thing I can throw in, if again I have people who are not too keen on using the drop downs, with pivot tables I can insert slicers as well. So if I don't see my pivot table tools, but I'm clearly in the pivot table, remember you may need to click the tab at the top of the screen. So as we've done with previous tables, we can also come in here and insert a slicer. And maybe I'll use salesperson, item, and country. I'll click OK, and that will give me these slicers. Try to sneak them in over here if I can. And in an instance like this, I'm faced with a couple situations. I can either move this chart over, but nothing stops me from clicking on these slicers and resizing them a bit. And I'm just eyeballing this. Then I can move the slicers over. There are alignment tools for these as well, but again, just going to try to go by eye. So in this situation, if I wanted to filter by the salesperson, didn't want to use the drop down, again, I can click on Walpole and it filters data by Walpole. If I'm only interested in looking at beer mugs and steak knives, I can click on beer mugs. I can click on steak knives. And let's say I only want to know my sales in Canada and England. I can click on Canada, and I can click on England. And I get my data. Well, it doesn't look like I've sold any beer mugs in England. That just logically doesn't make any sense. But anyway, if I want to go and clear these, of course I can always use these little funnels up here. It's the most convenient way to do it. And I can return the pivot table to where it was. The other thing I can do when it comes to my pivot table is I can click in the pivot table, and under the pivot table tools I can also add in an item here called a timeline. So I'll click insert timeline, and I'll choose date for the timeline because that only makes sense. And if I click OK, suddenly I've got a timeline down here. And what I can do with a timeline is, let's say I just want to get my sales from January up to and including May. I can click on January. Then, holding down my Shift key, I can click on May, and it will only give me the sales that have occurred between those 2 points in time. One other thing you can note with this as well, and in this case too, if I wanted to take it back to where it was, again I have a way here of clicking this little funnel and it'll take it back. Now if for whatever reason I wanted to go with a different time unit, I can click the down arrow here and you'll see that the pivot table can also be broken into years, months, days, and quarters. Probably wouldn't go with days, but if I needed to, I could certainly set it. If I set it to days, well, then you'll be doing an awful lot of scrolling if that's the case. But if you do need that level of precision, it is certainly there. I'm going to go and switch it back to months. Now you may say to yourself, once you've put on something like a timeline, and by the way, as was pointed out in a previous tutorial, if you click on a slicer, you get slicer tools that allow you to format and work with the design of the slicer. Same thing, if I click on the timeline, I get timeline tools, so I could use that to format the timeline and adjust it as I wish. And if I want to get rid of this stuff, let's say I don't have a use for the timeline anymore, I can always right click on it, and from there I can remove the timeline off the screen. It's not going to get rid of any of the data, it's just going to get rid of that little filtering system. So there is a multitude of ways to filter this stuff. Drop down arrows, slicers, timelines. One other item I want to draw your attention to would be the calculated field. And a calculated field is basically a way that I can throw calculations in to do things like projections of the future. In a pivot table, we just can't kind of throw in extra columns and put in calculations. So in that case, what I do is I click within the table, I go back to my pivot table tools, and I look for an item called Fields, Items, and Sets. Depending on the resolution of your screen, you may have these as separate buttons on the ribbon. But I'm going to go click on Calculated Field. And what I'm going to do is I want to create a field that's going to give me a 5% increase in profit. So the name I'll give it is 5% increase. The formula, I'm going to get rid of this 0, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a field of profit, and then I'm going to add, put in a plus sign, I'm going to put in an opening parenthesis, I'm going to add profit again, and I'm going to multiply it by 0.05, which will be the 5%. Now there's a couple different ways you could put that calculation together, but in the end what it's going to do is it's going to give me a field that will show me a 5% increase on my profits. Now if I go ahead and make sure I spelled that correctly and I click add, you're going to see I now have a field in here called 5% increase. If I click OK, you'll see that 5% increase has been added to my fields as well as my field list, and it's now sitting within the table. And if I just want to set it aside and bring it out later, I can take the check mark off. And if I need to bring it back, I can put the check mark back in and it reappears. And if I wanted to get rid of this, I could go back into my Fields, Items, Sets, my calculated field. I could go to my, I could choose my 5% increase actually from the drop down. And I could do a modification here if I wanted to, or I could go ahead and delete it if I wish. And in this case, I will delete it. Then I just OK it. The 5% increase is gone, and I'm kind of back to where I started.